Mas Hafizul is a legend of Malaysian chess. In this game, he's up against Paul Lauron from the Philippines. Paul opens with the move knight f3, after which Mas plays the move b5. In recent years, Mas has been experimenting with these systems as a way of getting his opponents out of theory. White now plays the move e3, and after a6, c4, Mas now takes on c4. And what Mas is going for is a position of this sort. Notice how Mas takes full control over the c5 square. And his idea is that it's impossible for White to stop the move c7 to c5, which he plays after having fully completed his development. White continues rook c1, and Black plays the move rook c8. Now White plays knight g3, and Mas takes on d4, giving White a question. How should he recapture on d4? Well, White decides to insert the move rook takes c8, a logical decision. Now queen takes c8 is possible, but Mas prefers to take with the bishop. And his idea is that he would prefer to have his queen on this diagonal, so he could possibly activate his queen on a5 or on b6. Now White decides to take back with the knight. It was also possible to take back with the pawn, retaining more control over the e5 square. But in this case, White's pawn structure isn't exactly the best. He has, as you can see, 3 pawn islands, and the pawn on d4 is isolated. And there are shades of the game Lasker Capablanca, which there was a very similar pawn structure. Although I would say this one is still a better version for White. So perhaps this is what he should have gone for. Because in the game after White plays knight takes d4, now Mas continues with queen b6, and he has a nice central majority and very active pieces. Black is comfortably equalized and now starts to play for more. Besides, it's not that easy for White to come up with a good plan. Here Paul plays the move f4. And after bishop b7, king h1. So it's hinting at some sort of activity on the king side. But Mas is simply faster. He first starts to move rook c8, and after another pointless move h3, he now starts to initiate his own play. So he first starts with the move knight c5, and after bishop b1, now Mas finds a very strong move. He plays the move knight a4. And the idea is that if White takes on a4, then Black can simply take the bishop on b2. So after a long think, Paul decides to retreat his bishop to a1. But here we see the idea of Mas. He plays his knight to c3. And now Black will get one of White's bishops. And after White gets one of the bishops, it will be much harder for White to create any sort of attack. Not to mention the fact that Black will then be left with the advantage of the 2 bishops. So White decides that the lesser evil is to give up the bishop on b1, which is a decision I agree with. Black takes on b1 and White recaptures. So now Mas decides to activate his last inactive piece and plays the move a5, preparing to bring the bishop out to a6. Now Paul plays the move a4. So he's preparing to meet the move bishop a6 with knight b5. And that's why I think Mas made what I think is quite a smart decision. And he played bishop c5. And his idea is that after rook c1, now he's going to play bishop a6, hitting the queen. And after knight b5, well, Black can simply take the pawn on e3. So that was perhaps not the best decision from White. Perhaps it was better to simply retreat the White queen, and although Black has a comfortable position, there's no real big problems at the moment. Well, in the game White did end up blundering the pawn. Here I was chalking this up as a win for Black. With an extra central pawn, things shouldn't be too difficult for an experienced player like Mas. But here, White starts to play very strongly. Bishop takes f6 is logical. black takes back, g takes f6. And here it's important to note that queen c3, hitting both the pawn and the bishop, doesn't really work because of the move queen c5. And if you take on f6, well, you're going to get checkmated on g1. So here white plays knight h5. A very simple idea of knight takes f6. And this is surprisingly difficult to deal with. But now Mas shows his class with the move queen c5. And he's going for queen c1 check and a counter-attack against the white king. White now takes on f6. And now Mas has a decision. In the game, Mas played the move king g7. But this is a mistake, allowing white to escape. Instead, it was better to play first king f8. And the idea is that after knight takes h7, now king g7. And with this nice pendulum maneuver, white is going to lose some serious material. The immediate threat is simply to play queen c1 check, and the black counter-attack will be decisive, with the pawn on f4 hanging with check. But in the game, king g7 was played, and now white immediately played the move knight h5, which was a mistake. Instead, white should have played the move queen takes h7, a stunning move. And it's very surprising because after king takes f6, it seems that after queen h4 check, the black king can simply run away with king f5. It's worth noting that, of course, king g7 leads to an immediate perpetual, which black cannot avoid. And this is a typical way to draw. But after king f5, seems like the black king is going to e4. But this is an illusion, because queen h7 check takes control of the e4 square, and the black king, well, in order to make any progress, must take on f4. As after king f6, we simply have a repetition. So black has to take on f4, and now white plays queen takes f7 check, and no matter where the black king goes, he cannot escape the checks. For instance, after king e4, black wants to go to d3, but again we see this same diagonal check, queen g6, king e5, and queen g7 check. The black king simply cannot escape. And it's a draw. But in the game, after knight h5 check, black can now tuck his king in the corner with king h8. And there's really nothing white can do. This is quite surprising. Perhaps white's best chance is to play queen c3. But this endgame is really terrible for white, as this passed pawn on the d file is going to become very strong indeed. But in the game, black played the move king f8, and now white should have taken the pawn on h7. Now perhaps white was worried about queen c1 check, but after king h2, black has nothing more than a perpetual. For instance, after queen g1 check, now the white king runs to g3, and if queen f2, then we simply go back. And there's nothing better than to go for a draw. An interesting try could be to play queen e1, threatening this typical mating pattern, with bishop g1 to f2 and queen g1. But here, white is in time with his own checks. He checks first on h8, and now checks on f6. And after king e8, now another check on h8. So if black plays king d7, now we're in time to check with our knight. And after king e7, knight g8. And there's no way for black to escape this perpetual. For instance, if king d7, then simply knight f6 back. But in the game, white panicked and played knight c3. After which the move d4 hits both knights. So here white only has one move to retain any sort of practical chances. And that's the same move queen h7. But with the knight on c3 hanging, this is much less strong, as now black can avoid the perpetual checks and win. Or can he? White gives a check on h8, king e7, and gives another check on f6, giving black a choice. Should he go to d7? Or should he go to d6? Now the move king d7 is counterintuitive because you're hanging the pawn on f7 with a check. But after king c6, the black king simply runs away, and white will soon run out of checks, as in this case. But after king d6, although black still retains a winning advantage, now white gets his own threats. He plays the move queen d8 check. Now black must block, otherwise if he moves the king then the bishop would hang. So black must block on d7, and now white plays knight f6, threatening checkmate on d7. Now black has a choice where to go with his queen. Obviously not queen c7 because knight e8 check wins the queen on the spot. But the other two possible squares look quite decent. I think the cleanest would have been simply queen c6. And after queen takes a5, c2, there's no stopping the black pawn. There's never going to be any sort of perpetual, as after queen e5 check, the king runs back, and after king f8, there's nothing more to say. The pawn simply queens. But in the game, black played the move queen c8, which I think was a slight practical mistake, because after knight e8 check, well, the black king has to be a bit brave and go to d5. White continues taking on a5 with check, but now the king slides up to d4 and runs into the white camp, where it's completely safe, and there are no more checks. But king c6 is the most natural move, and Mas played this very quickly. But now, queen takes a5. And don't even think of pushing a pawn, because that's checkmate in one move. So black has to take the knight, and he decides it's best to take with the bishop. But now white gets the important pawn on c3, and it's also a double attack on the king and the bishop. So Mas had to block with his bishop on c5, and now white plays b4, and is ready to take this pinned bishop on c5. Black plays king d6, and his idea is that after b takes c5, he's ready to recapture with his queen. So white of course plays the move queen e5 check, and after king e7, white now captures on c5. Black does get the pawn on a4, and we have a very complicated position where white has two pawns against a bishop. But it's extremely sharp as two of these pawns are passed, and the black king is quite open. White plays the move queen d6, and black played king e8. Now at this point, both players were down to 30 seconds, so I'll let you see what happens in real time. White now plays king h2, and black quickly plays queen b7. So you can see, Mas doesn't look like a fast player, but he's really quite speedy when he needs to be. White plays h4, pushing the pass pawn. Now bishop c6, hitting the pawn on g2. Now bishop takes g2 is actually a threat, so white has to be careful, but h5 is played. And actually black could have played taken the pawn on g2, and after h5 gone back to e4, stopping the pawn. But now he still has the threat of queen b2. So white plays queen e5, fantastic move, stopping queen b2. Now Mas is panicking, is hovering, and now goes back to d5 and h6. The pawn goes f5, a blunder, queen h8, king d7, and white loses on time. If things weren't tragic enough for white, he's actually completely winning in the final position. In fact, all he has to do is to go for a queen trade with queen g7, and after any king move, simply take the queen on b7, after which he simply plays h7 and the pawn queens. So a lucky escape from Mas, but as they say, the stronger player is always lucky. And this was definitely one of those cases. If you'd like to see more coverage like this, and make sure to like and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video.